The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 11, printed in House Report number 113-339, offered by Mr. Polis of Colorado.
Pursuant to House Resolution 470, the gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Polis, and a member opposed each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Colorado.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In 1972, President Nixon signed Executive Order 11644, which required that the U.S. Forest Service create travel management plans for the operation of off-road vehicles in our national forests, including snowmobiles. These travel management plans were designed to address the concerns of different users. They can be simple or detailed enough to affect noise, carbon emissions, traffic patterns, protect animal migratory patterns. In 2005, the Forest Service finalized its travel management rules for off-road vehicles in the National Forest System, except for snowmobiles, which were granted an exemption. Each year, outdoor enthusiasts contribute enormous amounts to our economy, and snowmobile supports thousands of jobs, not only in my district, but across the country. Not only do many of our residents enjoy snowmobiling, but it attracts significant tourism to areas like Eagle and Summit and Grand County, and actually creates jobs in our areas. Although snowmobiles were exempted from this rule, individual forest managers were still able to restrict snowmobile travel as appropriate on a case-by-case basis through individual travel management plans which met the unique needs of each area. In 2013, however, a federal district court in Idaho in the Winter Wildlands Alliance versus Forest Service case ruled the Forest Service must develop an overarching travel management rule that includes snowmobiles to comply with President Nixon's original executive order. This amendment states that while the National Forest Service develops this travel management plan, it's a sense of Congress that the Forest Service should continue to allow snowmobiles on federal lands during this rule's development with the same restrictions that were in place prior to the Winter Wildlands Alliance decision to ensure that the ability of snowmobilers to recreate is not interfered with because of this period where we are developing our permanent policy. Given the breadth of outdoor activities, it makes simple sense that public land should be available for multiple uses, including snowmobiling. About a quarter of Americans who participate in outdoor recreation enjoy motorized vehicles as part of that activity. And like other outdoor enthusiasts, snowmobilers contribute to communities by renting equipment, staying in hotels, purchasing souvenirs, enjoying local restaurants, and more. And as off-road vehicle use expands, it becomes increasingly important for the U.S. Forest Service to issue its rules to determine whether areas are open or closed to snowmobiles. This sense of Congress will allow that certainty that will allow our tourism industry to continue and our residents to continue to enjoy snowmobiling.
Would the gentleman yield?
I reserve the balance of my...
Would the gentleman yield?
I'll be happy to yield. I'd be happy to yield, yes.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. I say on a personal note, I was looking for you on the floor at the end of last week, and I was prepared to take Seattle and offer you 34 points, and I think you probably would have taken that bet. But I just want to make this point. If the gentleman will say that the results of on the gridiron in New Jersey last Sunday, if the gentleman will say that the better team won, and you don't have to make any other adjectives, but if the gentleman will say that, I will be more than happy to accept this amendment.
I will be happy to say on the record that the better team on that particular day won. There's still some doubt about whether that was in fact the Denver Broncos that took the field.
Well, I knew that the gentleman would find something to say, but I just wanted to say, as dealing with the amendment, I think this amendment, again, in the spirit of adding more activity on federal lands, I think this adds to it, and I'm prepared to support the amendment. I yield back to the gentleman and thank him for it.
I thank the chair, and I yield to the ranking member, Mr. DeFazio.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. I congratulate Mr. Polis and Congressman Kildee, who is detained at the White House, for offering this amendment. I appreciate that the majority has accepted it. This will be a temporary provision until such a time as the final rule is adopted. There was never I don't think any intent to have this sort of a blanket ban on snowmobiles, and this would correct that error by the Forest Service as they go through a deliberative process on where, when, and how snowmobiles will access federal forest lands on a unit-by-unit basis. I thank the gentleman.
And I thank the gentleman from Washington for his remarks. You know that when the defense of one team scores more points than the offense of the other team, you know your team's not in good shape. But I congratulate the gentleman. 12 seconds, fastest ever score in a way that was quite embarrassing for the Broncos, but we'll be back next year. We look forward to challenging in the NFL. I appreciate the support from both the Chair and the Ranking Member for Mr. Kilde's and my amendment. This rule will help the U.S. Forest Service improve management, prevent the disruption of the tourism industry, allow for the continued enjoyment of residents in snowmobiling, and ensure that off-road vehicles are used in a manner that protects natural resources, minimizes conflict with other users, and provides and protects motorized recreation. Until we finalize the travel plan, snowmobilers will be able to, under this sense of Congress, enjoy their favorite activity, and communities should continue to reap the economic benefits of hosting these winter sports enthusiasts. I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman's time has expired. Does anyone seek time in opposition? Seeing none, the question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Colorado. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chairs, the ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to.
Mr. Chairman,
The gentleman from Washington is
I move
recognized.
the committee to now rise.
The question is on the motion that the committee rise. All those in favor say aye. All those opposed say no. The ayes have it. The motion is adopted. Accordingly, the committee rises.
Very good, thank you. Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman?
Mr. Speaker, the committee of the House H.R. 3590, directing the report that
The Chair of the Committee of the Whole House on the State of the Union reports that the committee has under consideration H.R. 3590 and has come to no resolution thereon.
You'll be talking California law.
In front of the House, a message.
To the Congress of the United States. Section 202D of the National Emergencies Act provides for the automatic termination of a national emergency unless within 90 days prior to the anniversary date of its declaration, the President publishes in the Federal Register and transmits to the Congress a notice stating that the emergency is to continue in effect beyond the anniversary date. In accordance with this provision, I have sent to the Federal Register for publication the enclosed notice stating that the national emergency declared in Executive Order 13396 of February 7, 2006, with respect to the situation in or in relation to Côte d'Ivoire, is to continue in effect beyond February 7, 2014. The situation in or in relation to Côte d'Ivoire, which has been addressed by the United Nations Security Council on Resolution 1572 of November 15, 2004, and subsequent resolution has resulted in the massacre of large numbers of civilians, widespread human rights abuses, significant political violence and unrest, and fatal attacks against international peacekeeping forces. Since the inauguration of President Alassane Ouattara in May 2011, the government of Côte d'Ivoire has made progress in advancing democratic freedoms and economic development. While the government of Côte d'Ivoire and its people continue to make progress towards peace and prosperity, the situation in or in relation to Côte d'Ivoire continues to pose an unusual and extraordinary threat to the national security and foreign policy of the United States. For these reasons, I have determined that it is necessary to continue the national emergency and related measures blocking the property of certain persons contributing to the conflict in Côte d'Ivoire. Signed, Barack Obama, the White House.
Referred to the Committee on Foreign Affairs and order printed. For the House, the following personal request.
Leave of absence requested for Ms. Michelle Lujan Grisham of New Mexico for today.
Without objection, the request is granted. The Chair will entertain the request for 1-minute speeches. Purpose does the gentleman from North Carolina seek recognition?
I seek recognition to address the House for 1 minute and to revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, last week, North Carolina lost a real leader and a good man. my loyal friend, Sheriff Kerry Wenders of Wayne County. He was only 57 years old. Kerry was one of the youngest men to be elected as sheriff in Wayne County, and 2015 would have marked his 20th year of service. He was dedicated to the people he served and respected by all. Kerry was a lifelong member of Union Grove Free Will Baptist Church, where he met his wife of 33 years, Teresa. Family was everything to Kerry. Kerry had 3 daughters, Jessica, Ashley, and Carrie Ann, and 2 granddaughters. Mr. Speaker, Kerry was devoted to Wayne County and driven by his faith, his family, and his commitment to the citizens who put their trust in him. While it is a dark time in Wayne County, we know that the light of his life and his principled example will illuminate this community in the days ahead. Mr. Speaker, I yield back.
Under the Speaker's announced policy of January 3, 2013, the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Gingrich, is recognized for 60 minutes as a designee of the Majority Leader.
Mr. Speaker, thank you. Here we are now, February 2014. The second session of the 113th Congress has begun. The administration still has to deal with daily headlines speaking of the disaster of, you guessed it, the Affordable Care Act. I have to sometimes refer to that as the Unaffordable Care Act. Today, the news came from the nonpartisan CBO, Congressional Budget Office. My colleagues are all familiar with that. And their report states that the administration's rosy projections are mere fairy tale. If you take a dive into these numbers from the CBO, Mr. Speaker, you see last year's goals amended lower as low participation and atrocious rollout of the exchanges has finally caught up with those estimates. Let me just give you, colleagues, a few highlights. CBO lowered the estimate of exchange enrollees to 6 million. That's 1 million less than they estimated at this time last year. Now, this isn't all that surprising given the problems with the website, healthcare.gov, and the rest of the implementation of Obamacare, but it definitely reinforces a notion that this plan is not working. CBO estimates that 31 million Americans will still be uninsured in 2024. Now, you know, colleagues, when this bill was being discussed in Energy and Commerce way back in 2009, 2008 even, the Democratic majority at the time said there were 45 million people who were uninsured. That number really shrunk down considerably when you realize that there are a number of people who were eligible for Medicaid and just didn't know it. Could have been as many as 10 or 11 or 12 million. Obviously, a lot of people in this country illegally uninsured, but not eligible. And people making $75,000 a year in their household who could afford health insurance, but just chose, because of the Constitution, their personal liberty to pay as they went. It's not something I recommend, but CBO estimates now that in 2024, 10 years later, after the passage and full implementation on October the 1st of this year, 2014, that there'll still be 31 million Americans uninsured. What have we wrought? What have we really solved here? It doesn't sound like we've really helped very much. Now, this bill was sold to the American people as a solution to eliminate the uninsured. Instead, the bill only really adds cost in the form of very expensive mandates to everyone who already had insurance. And a lot of them now are just saying, you know, heck, I'll be one of these that'll go bare maybe set up my own savings account for health care and put $100 a month or whatever in a checking account and get a physical when I need it annually or biannually, and I'll pay my own way. And that's happening. Then they pay the little fine of $95. So that's what's happening, and it's quite a legacy for the President's signature piece of legislation. I don't think it's the legacy that he anticipated, and certainly not the one that he wants today. And finally, the headline from the Hill newspaper. Most of us read that, don't we, colleagues? We read all these newspapers and we don't run out of time. But in the Hill today, here's what it says, the headline, CBO, O-Care, O standing for Obamacare, O-Care slowing growth, contributing to job losses. The CBO projects that the law will reduce labor force compensation by 1% from 2017 to 2014, twice the reduction it previously had projected. This will decrease the number of full-time equivalent jobs by 2.3 million in 2021, and this is up from a previous estimate of 800,000. The big difference, my colleagues, in 2.3 million and 800,000. This is remarkable. Through a combination of higher health care costs resulting in lower compensation and perverse incentives for folks to not work as much to preserve their subsidies. It is truly not the American dream. The administration, Mr. Speaker, continues to push for more money for jobs programs, yet at the same time continue to fight for a bill that is yet to work and will lead to rewarding people for working less? What were these jobs programs? Just get rid of this, what can I call it? This worst bill maybe that's ever been passed in the history of this body, of this Congress. The Affordable Care Act has given us higher costs, not lower. It has performed much worse than was promised, much worse. And it will incent our citizens to work less. That's not what we want. That's really not what they want. Mr. Speaker, it is time for the administration to give in to reality and let us repeal this bill. I don't think it's the first choice to just sit back and see it collapse under its own weight. You hear that expression a lot. I think that very well could happen. But let's take maybe a more responsible approach. Mr. Speaker, I would say to the President, Mr. President, let's take a more responsible approach, and you work with the Congress, with Republicans and Democrats, with the House and the Senate. You get more engaged than you've ever been before, and work with us. Let's repeal it. Let's repeal it, and let's start over with something that truly does work, because we all agree that while we have the greatest health care on the face of this earth, why is it that people pay thousands of dollars to get on a jet plane to fly from other countries to come to the Mayo Clinic or Sloan Kettering or Wellstar health system in my district, the 11th of Georgia, to get their health care, to get their surgery, to get their treatment for cancer? You don't see people from this country going in the opposite direction because they get that good care here. So, Mr. President, we can work together. We can. American people want us to. They don't want one side jamming the other. They do want us to work together. And I want to take some time during this special order hour that our Republican leadership has afforded us. I hope some of my colleagues from the House GOP Doctors Caucus will be joining me momentarily, and I'll yield time to them. But the opportunity for us to explain to our colleagues on both sides of the aisle what needs to be done and how we can work together and clearly get this done and get it done in a timely fashion. If not this year, certainly in the 114th Congress. This Doctors Caucus that I mentioned, Mr. Speaker, is something that I put together a number of years ago, and we are now up to about 22 members. It's not, and I say doctors, so there are a lot of categories of doctors, but I'm talking about doctors that work specifically in the health care space, the 1/6 of the economy of this country. And these doctors can be medical doctors, they can be dentists, they can be psychologists, they can be advanced practice nurses. Indeed, even hospital administrators are part of this group because they know, they understand. In our caucus, we have probably 600 years of accumulated clinical experience. That means there's a little gray around the sideburns on a few of us, but this knowledge, this expertise, our leadership on the Republican side recognizes that. And our committee chairs on Energy and Commerce and Ways and Means and Labor and Workforce, every one of those committees that has any jurisdiction over health care, they understand that and they look to us. They look to us for expertise and guidance and explanation, just as we who have worked in the health care sector before we got elected to the Congress, we look to educators, we look to accountants, we look to attorneys in their previous lives to help us on issues that we're not so up to date on or have that level of expertise. And that's the way it should be, and that's the way it should be, in my opinion, on both sides of the aisle. So we Doctors Caucus meet on, if not weekly, at least every 2 weeks. We talk about issues. We've been talking about this Affordable Care Act for the last 3 years and going through it section by section and trying to have the thorough understanding, and we bring understanding to the table, but everybody can learn something that they didn't know in 2,700-page bill. But that's the due diligence that we have done over these last several years. And when we read in the media or we hear from the Democratic side of the aisle, either in this House of Representatives or from Majority Leader Harry Reid and the Democratic majority in the Senate saying, well, or even, Mr. Speaker, the President of the United States, how many times have we heard him say, if you have an idea, if you have a better plan, bring it to me. Bring it to me. I'm all ears. I want to listen. And we have done that, and I value the opportunity to be here today to explain some of the things that have been done and that they have really come through the House GOP Doctors Caucus. One of our members is my colleague from Georgia, an orthopedic surgeon, Dr. Tom Price. Dr. Tom Price and I served together in the Georgia Senate. We're medical colleagues, he an orthopedic surgeon, me an obstetrician. And now we've been in the Congress together for 10 years. And so he is a very active member of this House GOP Doctors Caucus. And he has a bill. Just set the record straight, colleagues. Let me tell you about Dr. Tom Price's bill, H.R. 2300, Impacting Patients First Act. Well, that bill is not 2,700 pages, but it's a comprehensive bill, and a lot of the sections in that bill are individual ideas that have come from the Doctors Caucus. I'm proud that he has included a number of my suggestions in regard to medical liability reform and other things. And so it is a compendium of ideas. And it's a very good bill, a very good alternative. It is market-driven. It does not interfere with the doctor-patient relationship, that sanctity, and it is a sanctity. And Dr. Price understands that, and every member of the House GOP Doctors Caucus understands that. And this bill, believe me, has the opportunity to get traction and to pass, when it's brought to this House floor, to pass this chamber. Now, at the same time, we just heard, Mr. Speaker, in recent days that the Senate has drafted a bill. It doesn't have a number yet, but Dr. Tom Coburn, the OBGYN family practitioner from Oklahoma, from Muskogee, who I've worked very closely with. The Doctors Caucus has worked very closely with he and Dr. Barrasso and Dr. John Bozeman, and so the Senate Republican doctors and the House Republican Doctors Caucus have worked together. And Dr. Coburn, along with Senator Burr from North Carolina, and Senator Orrin Hatch, one of the most senior and thoughtful and brilliant members of the Senate from the state of Utah, they have this bill. They call it the Patient Choice, Affordability, and Responsibility and Empowerment Act, the acronym Patient Care Act. Patient Care Act from the Senate. So we're right there, Mr. President. And with all due respect, we have ideas. We have Dr. Price's bill. We have Dr. Coburn's bill. We have other members of the Doctors Caucus, and the Doctors Caucus in the Senate is smaller, but we're here to help. We want to help. We truly want to bring down the cost of health care and maintain that quality that we're so proud of. And it can be done. It can indeed be done. Let me talk a little bit about the economy in regard to current law, PPACA, Obamacare, Patient Protection and Affordability Act. Obamacare has forced employers to cut hours, and as a result, part-time employment has gone through the roof. It has already forced many businesses to choose between, on the one hand, hiring new workers or providing health coverage. They just, Mr. Speaker, they just can't do both. President Obama always says health costs are rising at the lowest rates ever. Well, that's not because that's not because of his bill. That's because the economy is dragging. His bill has not helped the health care industry. The costs are lower because people are not seeking care. They don't have the money. And so, yeah, sure, the overall cost of health care are going down. But that's not a good thing. That's a bad thing. The Obama administration delayed the job-killing employer mandate for a full year. So that doesn't go into effect, colleagues, until January 1 of 2015, 11 months from now. But it left the rest of Americans on the hook for this massive tax hike. The bill adds costs to running a business, massive tax increases, and of course, as I said at the outset, higher monthly premiums. You know, one of the promises the President made, among many that he failed to keep, was that the cost, the average cost of a health insurance premium would be $2,500 a year lower than pre-Obamacare. Just the opposite has happened. And he never said anything, I don't think, about what the deductible would be, Mr. Speaker, but the deductible in some of these policies, an individual deductible might go from $1,000 a year to $3,000 a year, and a family deductible to, you know, from $3,000 a year to $8,000 a year. 200% increase, doubling of the monthly premiums. It creates just enormous uncertainty across large corporations, small businesses, and of course particularly the 1/6 of our economy, which is the healthcare industry. Think about the medical device tax and what it's doing to jobs in that industry. The medical device tax has already forced companies like Michigan-based Stryker Corporation to cut 1,000 jobs. Boston Scientific canceled plans to build new facilities in the United States, instead moving these high-paying, highly technical and innovative ideas, research jobs across the pond, overseas. Let's look for a moment at the effect on small businesses. I speak often, and I know all of you do too, on both sides of the aisle, because we go back home and we face our constituents. We have to and we should. And I speak often with these small business owners, the 11th District of Georgia, Northwest Georgia, and my 4 counties. I want to know how President Obama's health care law has affected the day-to-day operations of their companies. Well, Obamacare has not even been fully implemented because of all these executive orders and the fiats that come down and the waivers that are granted to certain ones but not others. So Obamacare really has not been fully implemented, even though the date is passed. But job creators and employees in Georgia and nationwide are already feeling the pain. Across the board, they've expressed frustration with its new rules and this moving target regulations, the increase in health care costs, and of course the uncertainty that they hate. And this law has certainly created a heck of a lot of that, hasn't it, colleagues? Obamacare has forced employers to cut hours, and as a result of that, part-time employment has gone up, as I said a few minutes ago. It has already forced many businesses to choose, again, do I hire that 50th worker? Do I hire that 50th worker? Or do I just say, no, I'm going to take 2 part-time workers instead of 1 full-time? Or even worse, I'm going to hire that 50th worker, but I'm going to drop health care coverage, Mr. Speaker, for all of my employees. And while I get a waiver for the first 30, for the next 20, I'm going to pay $2,000 a year per employee that will go into the exchange. One Georgia businessman who employs 47 people told me that Obamacare has forced him to hire subcontractors instead of hiring new full-time employees. Another owner who has 49 workers recently purchased a robot instead of hiring new welders. That robot doesn't have to feed a family of 4. The robot may be very efficient, but the robot doesn't have a heart and doesn't have anxiety. On Main Street, uncertainty and higher costs get even worse when a company needs to create more than 50 jobs, as I just mentioned, creating a barrier to job creation and the expansion of their business. Obamacare forces employees to work fewer hours to stay on as part-time workers. It's estimated that Obamacare will require American job creators, families, and health care providers to spend, get this, colleagues, more than 127 million hours a year on compliance. The EPA couldn't have been more onerous than this bill, and they're pretty darn onerous. One Georgia businesswoman has been forced to hold numerous meetings on company time for her employees to help them understand the paperwork involved in trying to get health care. Besides a loss in productivity, these new rules are costing her. She recently hired an outside health care expert just to ensure she is running her company by the books. By the books. Mitzi Smith, small plumbing company in Marietta, Georgia, is known for its quality and its compassion and the excellence of its workers. And yet they're struggling to hold on, even with a wonderful reputation, because of this law. Providing relief for taxpayers by delaying these costly mandates for 1 year is not enough, and I will continue fighting to dismantle every single piece of this train wreck law. And I've pledged to the people of Georgia that that's what I'm going to do. It's an accountability pledge. It's not a term limit pledge. It's just to say, look, I'm not up here to be a potted plant. You've hired me to be your voice, to speak for you on issues like this one. There are others, but I think now, as we approach the elections of 2014, what is more important than putting people back to work, to providing them assurance that they can keep their doctor, that they can keep their hospital, that they can keep the health care that they want, not larded up with a bunch of funded mandates, really, that are causing those premiums to go up that they don't need and they don't want. It's a one-size-fits-all, and in health care, one size, colleagues, and you know this, one size doesn't fit all. I mentioned a few minutes ago about the excise tax of 2.3% on medical devices. Let me mention a couple of companies that have been in touch with my office concerning this issue. Smith & Nephew Medical Company announced in February that it will lay off almost 100 workers in their Tennessee and Massachusetts plants. Cook Medical, very familiar name, has canceled plans to open 5, count them, 5 United States factories because the tax, this medical device tax, would cost them $20 million a year in the coming years. And remember, colleagues, this medical device tax is not on their profits. This is a tax on their revenue. So it's much more onerous than if it were just a tax on their profit. Boston Scientific, planning for a more than $100 million charge against earnings in 2013, has now built, get this, a $35 million research facility in, not Boston, but in Ireland, and is building a $150 million factory in China. Stryker Corporation, based in Michigan, blames the tax for 1,000 layoffs. Zimmer, based in Indiana, is laying off 450 people and taking a $50 million charge against earnings. Medtronics, one of my classmates from Georgia Tech, was the CEO of Medtronic, brilliant man, retired now, but I'll never forget him. He was brilliant at Georgia Tech and throughout his entire career. And he was the CEO at a time for Medtronic, and they make heart valves and many life-saving medical devices. They expect an annual charge against earnings of $175 million. Covidien has cited the tax in explaining 200 layoffs and a decision to move some production to Costa Rica and Mexico. I have nothing against Costa Rica and Mexico. Great countries, great people. But, you know, when we're looking at an unemployment rate, 6.7%, if you believe that, it's probably close to 15% when you count all the people that have just given up. They've been unemployed for over a year, and they're just they're not even counted anymore. So, you know, we've got, you know, I could go on and on and on and give you examples. I'll give you one more. Guthrie, Oklahoma Taco Bell has cut its full-time employees' hours to 28 per week or less. If you had a job and you got to work 28 hours a week, colleagues, I don't know about y'all, but I would need 3 of those jobs to support my family and my children and help support my grandchildren. Former employee Jonna Davis said, and I quote Jonna, "They informed everybody, the company, that nobody was considered full-time any longer, that everybody was now considered part-time, and they would be cutting hours back to 28 or less due to Obamacare." Spiritware, an Idaho-based clothes company that specialized in licensed college and football team colors and logo apparel, is poised to more than double their business this year. Mr. Speaker, that's great news, isn't it? However, the company is on the cusp of having 50 full-time employees. She is upset that what seems to be her best solution, hiring independent contractors, would give her less control, and it would, over worker hours and how much involvement they can have in other parts of the company. Darden Restaurants, parent company of such well-known and very good restaurants like Olive Garden and Red Lobster and Longhorn Steakhouse. They tested making some workers part-time last year. The chain has decided not to make all full-time workers part-time, but it has not ruled out a broader shift toward that very thing, part-time work. And then in January 2014, Target announced that they would no longer provide health care coverage for their part-time employees. I could, as I say, Mr. Speaker, I don't know how much time I have left. How much time do we have left, Mr. Speaker?
The gentleman has 29 minutes remaining.
We have some time left, but I think colleagues, that you get the picture here. We have a real problem right here in River City. And by that I mean the nation's capital, but I also mean the entire country. And we have to do something about it. We can't just keep kicking the can down the road as we have done with Medicare and Social Security. Needed reforms, protections, strengthening to make sure that these programs are there for our children and our grandchildren. But here we have created a whole new entitlement program that really, when you look at it, it's punishing both our seniors and our young, because it's forcing the young people who finally reach that 27th birthday, and they can no longer now be on their parents' health insurance plan. Maybe they've been living at home post-college, and the parents have finally just said, honey, you're just going to have to move out. We need our space. We need a little privacy. And these young people have a job, and they want to move out with a friend or someone that they went to school with. They want to move on with their lives. They're adults now, and they've got a job, and they find that to get health insurance, it's astronomical, and yet the salary that they make, their entry-level salary, is too much to make them eligible for a subsidy. So what are they going to do? They're going to pay that fine, that $95 fine, and maybe even when it gets to $600, they're going to pay that, and they're going to go bare. And I don't want to see. I mean, you know, I use that as an expression of not having health insurance coverage. And they may be 10 foot tall and bulletproof. They may take care of themselves. They may not do skydiving and some risky sort of behavior. But, you know, you never know when that Mack truck's going to run you down and you're going to end up in the emergency room. So we want to make sure we get this right. So far, we have gotten it totally wrong. But we can do better. We will do better. We need to do it in a bicameral, bipartisan way. I mentioned my colleague, Dr. Price, and his bill. I mentioned my other colleagues on the House GOP Doctors Caucus as we continue to work on things. My co-chair, Dr. Phil Rowe, a fellow OBGYN from Tri-Cities, Tennessee, former mayor of Kingsport or Johnson City. We can do it, and we will do it. But, Mr. President, you said if you like what you have, you can keep it. You also said if anybody, member of Congress, has a better idea, bring it to you, and you will consider it. Well, I've mentioned 2 bills here tonight. We have other ideas, and you have 2.5, almost 3 years left in your second term. You want a legacy? We're going to help you have a legacy, and a good one. But you got to work with us. It's a two-way street. And with that, I'll yield back the balance of my time.
Members are reminded to direct all remarks to the chair. Under the Speaker's announced policy of January 3rd, 2013, the chair recognizes the gentleman from Iowa, Mr. King, for 30 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it's an honor to be recognized to address you here on the floor of the House of Representatives in this great deliberative body that we are part of. And I appreciate the delivery of Mr. Gingrey a little bit earlier. And I wanted to take us, if I could direct your attention, Mr. Speaker, to the situation in the Middle East. And we know that the implication in our Constitution is that the President conducts the foreign policy. I'd teach that class if I had the time, and I don't disagree with that. But also, this Congress has a responsibility. We have responsibilities, for example, that are specific within the enumerated powers of the Constitution, and if anyone thinks that the House of Representatives or the United States Senate or Congress itself as a body doesn't have a voice on foreign policy, I'd direct them to the enumerated power of the power to declare war. Certainly, we have also foreign policy responsibilities here, and we appropriate funds for foreign aid and a good number of other resources that go to help out countries that are either our allies or hopefully will become our allies one day. There's a lot that we do that has to do with foreign policy. We have a Foreign Affairs Committee. We have Select Committee on Intelligence. We have Armed Services. All of those things are committees that deal with issues that have to do with our foreign relations and our foreign policy. And so because of that, Mr. Speaker, a number of us in this Congress have taken a responsibility to step forward and be engaged in foreign policy and also to have a voice and be better informed than simply letting the message come from the White House. I see that my friend from Utah is prepared to perhaps deliver a statement, and I'd be happy to yield back to the Speaker for whatever purpose that might be.
Speaker, if I could have your recognition, I send to the desk a privileged report from the Committee on Rules for the filing under the rule.
The clerk will report the title.
Report to accompany House Resolution 472, resolution providing for consideration of the bill H.R. 2954 to authorize Escambia County, Florida, to convey certain property that was formerly part of Santa Rosa Island National Monument and that was conveyed to Escambia County subject to restrictions on use and reconveyance, and providing for consideration of the bill H.R. 3964 to address certain water-related concerns in the Sacramento-San Joaquin Valley and for other purposes.
Refer to the House calendar and order printed.
Thank you. And I appreciate the courtesy.
The gentleman from Iowa.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate the gentleman from Utah, and not only what he's done here today, but his leadership. And I want to take a point to make the message here as a topic that's coming up now, as a rule that was referenced by the gentleman from Utah about the San Joaquin Valley and the drought in California and the valley. I have traveled out there, and I've been there to see about 250,000 of 600,000 acres that were man-made drought, and now we have nature-made drought that's coupled with a man-made drought, and I intend to support the legislation that comes to floor tomorrow. And I thank especially the California delegation for leading on this and helping the rest of the country understand how important the water issues are around the country. I've worked with water and water management all of my professional life, and these issues come close to home when you either need water or you can't get rid of it. And that's what this bill is tomorrow. It's about needing water and directing it to the best resources. But if I would, Mr. Speaker, revert back to the topic at hand, and that's the topic of the foreign policy and the very solid constitutional claim that Congress has to be engaged in foreign policy, to help manage that foreign policy and to appropriate resources to foreign policy. And to that end, a number of us in this Congress, and not nearly enough of us, have been involved in foreign policy and free trade agreements and traveled to a good number of countries to engage with people in other parts of the world to help stitch together and knit together our relationships that are so important. And so I would take, first I could, Mr. Speaker, paint the big picture of what the world looks like. And a little bit of history first, and then a picture of how the globe looks today. And I take us back to World War II, which was the most dramatic shift in power that the world has seen, at least in my understanding of history. And we saw the clash of the Imperial Japanese and the Nazi regimes that threatened to swamp the entire world. And having fought back a world war on two fronts, in Asia and across the Pacific and in Europe, here in America, we see this as the time that America rose to become a superpower. And we saw then, and immediately after World War II, we saw the Cold War begin. And the Soviet Union formed as a product, in part at least, a product of World War II, clashing with the United States in that Cold War that lasted for 45 years. And there was two different ideologies. It's free enterprise capitalism, it's God-given liberty, challenged up against the forces of the former Soviet Union, which were atheistic and communistic and a managed economy from top down. We saw what happened. We saw how that was resolved, Mr. Speaker, and it was described, I think, best by Jeane Kirkpatrick, who was the ambassador for Ronald Reagan to the United Nations, when she said sometime about 1984, as she stepped down as ambassador to the United Nations, she said, what's going on in the world, in this Cold War, in this clash, this competition between the two huge ideologies? What's going on between the Soviet Union and the United States is the equivalent of playing chess and Monopoly on the same board. And the question is, will the United States of America bankrupt the Soviet Union economically in the monopoly part of the game before the Soviet Union checkmates the United States of America in the chess component of the game? Monopoly and chess on the same board, the Russians building missiles and expanding their military capability and trying to outdo the United States to the point where we would have to capitulate, while we were pushing our economy, and this growing dynamic free enterprise economy was competing against the managed economy, the communist economy of the Soviet Union. And what happened was, the monopoly game, the monopoly winners won out, and the Soviet Union was bankrupted, and because of that, the country collapsed and imploded upon itself about 1991, and they had to reform back around to, they could say, former Soviet Union, Russia and some of its federation countries, safer for the world, because that clash of the two huge ideologies has been diminished significantly. The threat of a nuclear war has been diminished significantly thanks to Ronald Reagan, Margaret Thatcher, Pope John Paul II, and some will say Gorbachev. Those four personalities engaged together were the leadership that brought about the dynamic that brought an end to the Cold War. And in the aftermath of the Cold War, there were those sitting around cold warriors to celebrate the end of the Cold War, a victory for the free world, not only the United States, but our allies, a victory for the free world. And as they celebrated, they got ready to raise their glasses. One of them said, just a minute, don't be too soon to celebrate, because, think of this, the world will not long tolerate a lone superpower. There will be allegiances and alliances made that you've not imagined that will line up against the United States. And if those forces line up against the United States, and they will, we will find ourselves with competition and enemies that we have not seen before in the world. And some of those will be an alliance that does include Islamic nations lined up against the United States. That statement was made late part of 1991, I believe it was, and here we are, and that would be at least a decade, roughly a decade before the attack on the United States, September 11th of 2001. That very prescient comment that was made before they celebrated the end of the Cold War, before the glasses went up, Mr. Speaker, there was a realization that we would have new enemies that would form, and they would form coalitions against us. And so because of that, we should be aware of where we are today. Those enemies that have formed against us, a lot of them have been radical Islamists that have decided that they want to kill Americans because they disagree with our ideology. We should not believe that somehow it's just a matter of we live in one place on the globe and others live in another place and we end up in war with each other and people trying to kill us. That's not the circumstances in that way. Instead, it is competing ideologies, people that have a different belief system, people that believe that if they need to have enemies so that they can demonize those enemies and mobilize their people, and if they can mobilize their people against a demonized enemy, they have a better chance of hanging on to power. That's the circumstances in Iran, where they describe the United States of America as being the great Satan. And it is the public policy of Iran to declare America to be the great Satan. They teach it in their schools, and they are spinning centrifuges for the purposes of developing nuclear weapons and a means to deliver it. And the President has contended that his negotiations with Iran have slowed down their nuclear weapon effort, and perhaps they'll be able to talk Iran into stopping their nuclear effort. Mr. Speaker, I'd take you back to September of 2003, where I sat in on a meeting with the ambassadors to the United States from France, Great Britain, and the United Kingdom. And they sat around a group of members, and the discussion was about whether we should open up negotiations with Iran on their nuclear capability. And after I listened to them, the three of them, and every member that was around that table, not very many, and I was a low man on the seniority totem pole at the time, I had to wait my turn to speak, of course. And then I asked those of the ambassadors, why are you here? What's your objective in meeting with us to have this discussion about opening up negotiations? Dialogue was the word, dialogue with Iran. And their answer was, we want you to open up dialogue with Iran so that you can help us, because we think that their three countries, France, United Kingdom, and Germany, at the table with the United States, we have a chance of convincing the Iranians not to continue any further with their nuclear endeavor. September 2003. I listened to that response and I said, if we open up negotiations or open up dialogue with Iran, what are you prepared to do then if we take step one into these negotiations? And their answer was, we want to open up dialogue. That's our objective, as if there wasn't a step 2, 3, 4, or 5. But we know that once you open up the dialogue, you have to be willing to follow through with something. And so I said, if the United States steps up to negotiate with Iran, and it's clear that they have an objective to develop a nuclear weapon and a means to deliver it, but if the United States steps up and opens that dialogue, then you're suggesting that we enter into formal negotiations, and in those negotiations you understand that if we fail to convince Iran that they should stop developing a nuclear, Are you prepared then to go to the United Nations for a resolution? Are you prepared to bring sanctions against Iran? And if the sanctions aren't effective, are you prepared to blockade Iran? And if you're prepared to blockade Iran and the blockade's not effective and they continue to develop a nuclear weapon, and somebody's got to step up to that line in the sand with men and equipment and munitions and military supplies and put blood on the line along with the treasure, are you prepared to step up to that line in the desert sand? And of course, the ambassadors were real nervous about that discussion long before I got to the part about the line in the sand in the desert. And as they expressed their will, which was, let's just open up dialogue, they had to also recognize that when you open up dialogue, you start down the path of dialogue negotiations, United Nations resolution, sanction, blockade, and eventually, if Iran is committed, there's going to be a showdown. And I said to them, you see, if we start down this path, we have to be prepared to follow all the way through. And let's understand that we're prepared before we start, because I will tell you that Iran is committed to developing a nuclear weapon and a means to deliver it. They are committed. It isn't just a feint on their part. It isn't just a motion in that direction. They're committed. And if we aren't committed to go all the way to putting that line in the sand and lining up on that line in the sand and following through, and I said these words this way, then Iran will play us like a fiddle, and when this is all done, they'll have their nuclear weaponry, and they'll have their means to deliver it, and we'll just look like a bunch of foolish negotiators. Mr. Speaker, I bring this up because now here we are, these 10-plus years later. Iran's in a position where they'd like to have the rest of the world think that they are slowed down and maybe given up on their effort to develop nuclear. They still take a public position that they never were really developing a nuclear weapon, that they were just enriching uranium for the purpose of generating electricity in their oil-rich country. And of course, no one should have ever bought that from the beginning. But our administration seems to think that if they negotiate in good faith, the Iranians are going to negotiate in good faith. I think it expresses it indicates some naivety about the minds of the people that want nuclear weapons. A nuclear weapon capability is far more valuable to Iran in their negotiations than talking nice to the United States. Especially, why do they care about us for friends if they're teaching their children to hate us? If we are the great Satan, they don't have a lot to gain in public opinion in Iran by talking to the United States. So we should understand their motives. Their motives are to dominate that part of the world with a nuclear capability, to threaten that part of the world. And they've already said that they have targets chosen in the United States. That's an Iranian public position today. And if you look at the method that they could have to deliver a nuclear weapon, which might only be weeks or months away, and we can have inspectors in Iran that are examining anything that we want to examine, but that doesn't mean the Iranians don't decide that they're going to throw a public relations tantrum and kick all of the inspectors out of Iran and only be 2 or 3 months from having that nuclear weapon. So they can choose now, when the time is right for them, when the time is right for them politically, to make that move. And even if they've slowed this down, and even if they're not putting more centrifuges in place, the question is, are they still spinning? And what happened to the enriched uranium? And even if they dilute the enriched uranium down below 20%, it's another chemical reaction to enrich it again. It doesn't take very long. At best, they've slowed their operations down in order to pick up $4 or more billion into their economy that they need. And because of the suffering that their economy is because of the sanctions. So we're being played again. It's just part of the fiddle. We're being played like a fiddle. We've been played like a fiddle for the last 10 years. And the conviction and the resolve from our leaders isn't strong enough. And I have said from this floor, Mr. Speaker, that if I were the lead guy, the lead person on negotiations with Iran, and I'll just take us back to the Ahmadinejad era so we can think of the personality on the other side of that, would do it this way. I would just simply back-channel information, probably through the Swiss, and that in the diplomatic channel, back-channel into Ahmadinejad and the mullahs, and it would be this. Presuming that we're calling the shot here in foreign policy, it would be, Mr. Ahmadinejad and Iranian mullahs, I have decided, we here in the United States, but I have decided the date beyond which you will not be allowed to continue your nuclear endeavor. And I've taken the liberty to put an X on the calendar that sets that date. Now, you don't know that date, but I do. And beyond that date, you'll not be allowed to continue your nuclear endeavor, whatever it takes to do so. And it will be dramatic, and the world will know. And you'll certainly be the ones to get the first announcement, because that's when the kinetic action starts. That's the implication, not the words. And then I would say, but you know, if you hustle up and decommission and tear down your nuclear development equipment, and you do that with our inspectors to our satisfaction, or with an intermediary that we can trust, we'll help you with that, and we'll help you with some resources to do so, and we'll even help you with public opinion so that you can save face as you back up from this clash of civilizations that's bound to come if we let you go down this path. Again, Mr. Ahmadinejad, you don't know that date, but I do. And we can forestall the inevitable if you decommission and tear this down. But you've got to mean it. It can't be a bluff. It's got to be a real X on the calendar. It's got to be a real date. And maybe no one else knows it. Maybe only the leader in the free world knows that date. But he's got to mean it. And short of that, we get played like a fiddle, and here we are, stretching this thing out again, with the world in an ever more dangerous place in that part of the world. I can stand there and listen to the intellectuals and say, Europe, for example, and I mentioned the foreign travel, and listen to them say, well, of course, a nuclear-capable Iran is preferable to a military strike to take it out. They utter that in the same fashion that people in this country would utter, well, of course it's the CO2 emissions from U.S. industry that's one day going to cause the Earth's temperature to go up, as if somehow that was a conventional knowledge that was accepted by everyone. And, Mr. Speaker, I reject that way of thinking. The idea that a nuclear-capable Iran is preferable to a military strike to take it out isn't a rational conclusion that one can draw. You have to start with a flawed premise to get to that conclusion and say it's rational. There are a lot of rational conclusions that are built upon false premises, I might add, and that would be one. But a nuclear-capable Iran threatens all of the Middle East. Their immediate target would be Tel Aviv. And Tel Aviv, which, by the way, is not very highly populated with anything other than Jewish people, which would be their ideal target. And so it's a short missile strike from Iran to Tel Aviv. They know that. They certainly know that in Israel. And today, what they know is they don't have the level of confidence that the United States is standing quite as strongly next to Israel as we have in the past. And that message has been sent by our President in our foreign policy for some time. The idea that Israel should go back to the 67 borders says somehow as if the 67 borders were defensible. Well, they were defended in 67, they were defended in 73, but they expanded their defensive borders because of that. Israel traded some land for peace. It didn't work out very well. The Gaza Strip is a place to launch attacks on the Israelis, as is Lebanon, and Hezbollah is occupying large chunks of Beirut and Lebanon. And that becomes a place where there are now some tens of thousands of missiles that are lined up there aimed at Israel, ever more dangerous place, and somehow we think that we can talk nice to the Iranians and they're going to treat us nice, and somehow good reason is going to get something accomplished with negotiations. Mr. Speaker, it is very rare to ever see a diplomatic error take place in negotiations. Instead, you have to have leverage. And that leverage is going to come from economic, military, perhaps political, that could come from mostly from other entities. If you don't have those forces at place in something that you can give, do, or give up, you're not going to just get, well, we like you, Mr. President. You said if you unclench your fist, we'll extend our hand. I didn't see Iran unclench its fist, but I saw our hand extended, and some of our hand was played, and some of our hand or our hole cards have been seen now and showed to the other side. It's a very, very dangerous proposition. And looking over there in the same neighborhood to Syria, where it became the issue du jour that Syria had weapons of mass destruction. It's hard to make the case in this Congress that Syria had weapons of mass destruction, that, of course, none of them came out of Iraq, because it's conventional belief over on this side of the aisle, Mr. Speaker, that Iraq didn't have weapons of mass destruction. regardless that Saddam gassed his own people, regardless that we did secure yellow cake uranium in Iraq. We did take it out of Iraq and transport it across the Atlantic Ocean, down the St. Lawrence Seaway and up to Canada so it could be converted into power generation. In spite of all of that, nobody seems to think that any of that could have gotten over across the border, or any weapons of mass destruction such as gas could have gotten across the border into Syria, even though we all agree that Assad used gas against his own people. We'd like to put an end to that. But once the President showed his hand on that and the British lost the vote on the floor, I believe it was the House of Commons, the President came to Congress and said, well, now I want to strike Syria, and why don't you give me the authority to do that? That was an implied message, not a direct one, Mr. Speaker, I might say, not a formal one. And it was clear that neither the House nor the Senate had an appetite to go into military action in Syria. So we fell back on Putin and the Russians to be the negotiators with the weapons of mass destruction in Syria. And we saw the promise that the gas was going to be accumulated, picked up, and transported out of Syria by the end of the year. That was the end of last year, not the end of this year, Mr. Speaker. And so now it's going to take perhaps another 6 months and another and another and another. A static position in the world now where Syria has digressed down to the point where it's hard to find a friend in Syria. The President said here in this very chamber at his State of the Union address last week when he said that we're going to oppose the regime and we're going to support our friends in Syria. It's hard to find friends in Syria. This conflict may have gotten to the point where there's neither side is a side that's either going to support us or one that we should support. My message is in Syria it has devolved downward into a very difficult, static, ugly situation with a lot of blood and death in Syria. It threatens to spill over. Of course, we have the nuclear threat that has slowed down but not necessarily suspended in Iran. And in the rest of our foreign relations around that part of the world, we're 2.5 years or more into the Arab Spring. And in almost every one of those changes, some regime changes, some civil wars, some that reached a static impasse, the result of that hasn't been favorable to U.S. interests. And you could go country after country, the conflicts around. And so myself and several members took a trip over into that part of the world right before Christmas to assess the situation. And we need to do that because assessing the situation from here turns out that there's a lot of information that's not very reliable that comes out of the White House and the State Department with regard to that part of the world. So we traveled into Egypt and into Lebanon and into Libya and into Israel, among other places. And we met with their top leaders in most all of those countries. And we got and on down the line. And of course we met with our State Department and got the in-country briefing. It works out like this. Short version is Lebanon is a mess, and I think it's intractable, and I don't know how you resolve it. And in Libya, the civil war didn't resolve it. There's still the radical militant Islamists control Benghazi, and it's not safe enough to go there for their government, let alone for representatives of our government. So Libya is at an impasse. They'd like to be able to put together a functioning government in Libya, and I'm impressed with some of the people that are leadership there. But if they can't control Benghazi, Benghazi militants can come in and threaten Tripoli, for example, and have. Then Egypt, though, Mr. Speaker, has turned, I think, in a very good and positive direction in that they rose up and threw Morsi out. Morsi, the face and the voice of the Muslim Brotherhood in the country of the origin of the Muslim Brotherhood, was rejected by the Egyptian people, and 30 to 33 million of 80 million Egyptians went to the streets mid-last summer to demand that Morsi and the Muslim Brotherhood be taken down and out of government. It was a popular uprising, and with the pleadings of the popular uprising, then you saw the Egyptian military take charge. We have met with them, myself, eye to eye, at least twice, and at different levels within the government and two different trips over there. They have written a constitution, one that protects even Christian religious interests there and commits resources to rebuilding our burned churches in a place like Egypt. They've ratified a constitution in that election, 14th and 15th of January. Now you have elections set up for a parliament, and behind that, a presidential election. I expect we will see a legitimate civilian government in Egypt sometime in less than a half a year. And at that point, the voice of the Egyptian people, at least is structured to be heard through the government, a relatively new experience for the Egyptians. So there's a lot that's been turning in the world, Mr. Speaker, and I mentioned the threat to Israel, that we need to stand more closely with them shoulder to shoulder and make an even stronger commitment to support them. They're going to have to face up to and they're going to have to decide if they have to take action against an existential threat, which is a nuclear-capable Iran. We need to decide who we're going to be friends with. It's not the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. Even though it looks like this administration has lined up with the Muslim Brotherhood, it's not the Muslim Brotherhood. The American people don't support the Muslim Brotherhood, and they don't support the militant wings and arms that are components of the Muslim Brotherhood and those affiliates of those militant wings and arms that might say they're not but operate in concert, especially in places like Syria. We need to understand that this world is lined up and to some degree against us. We've had friends in that part of the world that go back deep and long. And Egypt is one of those countries. 1954, when President Eisenhower made it clear that he was going to stand with the Egyptian people, we have had them as allies, and we've worked military operations in the Sinai for a long time. We need to restore those relationships with the Egyptian people and I think the soon-to-be legitimized civilian government of Egypt. We need to let people know, like the United Arab Emirates, that we're going to stand with them as they're going to stand with us. We want the modern interests in the Middle East that are engaged in petroleum production and diplomacy and the growth of their own economies. We want to stand with them. We've had a good, strong interest in the Middle Eastern part of the world, and it's been fractured time after time after time by the results of radical Islamists and Muslim Brotherhoods coming into these countries throughout this long, long period of the Arab Spring, Summer, and Fall times 2.5. Mr. Speaker, this nation is looked to by the rest of the world to lead. And that means we need to have a strong State Department, a strong foreign policy, a clear, coherent moral message. And it's got to be that we stand with our friends, and we should understand that just because there is an election in a country, that doesn't mean that democracy is going to be manifested or it's going to be the solution. Mr. Speaker, we need a stronger foreign policy, we need more members of this Congress taking an interest, and we need a president that gets it right. With that, I yield back the balance of my time.
The chair lays before the House an enrolled bill.
H.R. 2642, an act to provide for the reform and continuation of agricultural and other programs of the Department of Agriculture